1917, Photoplay reported that the most important service that Anita Loos has so far rendered the screen is the elevation of the subcaption, first to sanity, then to dignity and brilliance combined. The trick has been subsequently used by Woody Allen and Nancy Meyes, among others. Loos had so convinced D.W. Griffith of the value of the intertitle that he called her the most brilliant young woman in the world and made her the first female screenwriter of Hollywood. An intertitle is a printed narration or portion of dialogue flashed on the screen between the scenes of a film. A prolific writer who appeared in the press in a manner as glamorized as the stars she wrote for, Anita Loos wrote over 150 scripts in her 30 years as a Hollywood screenwriter and elevated intertitles to an art. She is best remembered not only for defining the silent era personas of stars like Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Talmadge sisters Constance and Norma, but for also creating the character of Lorelei Lee in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, a 1925 novel adapted to films in 1928 and 1953. Edith Wharton called the book the Great American Novel, and you can learn more about Edith Wharton on this channel. Anita was also known as Mrs. John Emerson, Corrine Anita Loos, J. Emerson Loos, and Anita Loos spelled with 2 U's. Loos was born in Sisson, now Mount Shasta, California, to Richard Beers Loos and Minerva Ellen, or Minnie, Loos in 1888. She had one sister, Gladys Loos, and one brother, Dr. Harry Clifford Loos, a physician and co-founder of the Ross Loos Medical Group. Ross Loos revolutionized healthcare in California and offered a plan whereby citizens who were also employees of Los Angeles County and the Department of Water and Power could pay monthly payments for medical care. The plan ended in 1999 after being absorbed by big insurance and was founded in 1929. It served over 2,000 employees in its heyday and was guaranteed payment by virtue of employee incomes from taxpayer dollars. About pronouncing her name, Loos said, "The family has always used the correct French pronunciation, which is Loos. However, I myself pronounce my name as if it were spelled loose, since most people pronounce it that way and it was too much trouble to correct them." Loos' brother Clifford, however, always corrected people as to its pronunciation. Her father founded a tabloid newspaper, the Sisson Mascot, for which her mother did most of the work as publisher. In 1892, when Anita was 3 years old, the family moved to San Francisco, where her father bought the newspaper The Dramatic Event, a veiled version of the British Police Gazette, with money that Minerva, Anita's mother, borrowed from her father. You can learn more about films set in San Francisco in its video on this channel. By age 6, Anita wanted to be a writer just like her father. While living in San Francisco, she accompanied her father, an alcoholic, on exciting fishing trips to the pier, exploring the city's underbelly and making friends with the locals. This fed her lifelong fascination with lowlifes and loose women. She said her earliest memories were of San Francisco. In 1897, at their father's urging, Loos and her sister performed in the San Francisco Stock Company production of Quo Vadis. Anita's only sister, Gladys, died at age 8 of appendicitis while their father was away on business. No white privilege here. Anita continued appearing on stage as the family's breadwinner. Her father's spendthrift ways caught up with them, and in 1903 he took an offer to manage a theater company in San Diego. Anita performed simultaneously in her father's company and under another name with a more legitimate stock company. After graduating from San Diego High School, Loos devised a method of cobbling together published reports of Manhattan's social life and mailing them to a friend in New York City who would submit them under that friend's name for publication back in San Diego. Her father had written some one-act plays for the stock company, and he encouraged his daughter to write plays too. She wrote The Inkwell, a successful piece for which she received periodic royalties. In 1911, the theater was running one-reel films after each night's performances as a show of early film. Anita would take a perfunctory bow and run back to the back of the theater to watch these reels. She sent her first attempt at a screenplay, He Was a College Boy, to the Biograph Company, for which she received $25. The New York Hat, starring Mary Pickford and Lionel Barrymore and directed by D.W. Griffith, was her third screenplay and the first to be produced in 1912. Loos dredged real life, including her own, where she begged her father for a new hat he couldn't afford, for scenarios. She dished up her father's cronies and brother's friends, also using the rich vacationers from the San Diego resorts as inspiration. Eventually, every experience became grist for her script mill. By 1912, at the age of 24, Loos had sold scripts to both the Biograph and Lubin Studios. Between 1912 and 1915, she wrote 105 scripts, all but 4 of which were produced. She wrote 200 scenarios before she ever visited a film studio. In 1915, trying to escape her mother's influence and objections to a career in Hollywood, Loos married Frank Palma Jr., the son of a band conductor. But Frank proved to be penniless and dull. After 6 months, Anita sent him out to buy hairpins, and while he was gone, she packed her bags and went home to her mother. However, she remained married on paper. After that, Anita's mother rethought her position on a daughter's Hollywood career. Accompanied by her mother, Anita joined the film colony in Hollywood, where Griffith put Loos on the payroll for Triangle Film Corporation at $75 a week, with a bonus for every produced script. Without Southerner Griffith's eye for talent and protection of women on his sets, he has never been accused of sexual assault either during or after his lifetime, unlike Louis B. Mayer and many others backed by big banks. Hollywood would have probably failed. Many of the scripts she turned out for Griffith went unproduced. Some he considered unfilmable because the laughs were all in the lines. There was no way to get them onto the screen. But he encouraged her to continue because reading her scripts amused him. Her first screen credit was for an adaptation of Macbeth in which her billing came right after Shakespeare's. When Griffith asked her to assist him and Frank E. Woods in writing the intertitles for his epic Intolerance of 1916, she traveled to New York City for the first time to attend its premiere. Intolerance is an incredible film, and you can watch it on YouTube today. Instead of returning to Hollywood, Loos spent the fall of 1916 in New York and met with Frank Crowninshield of Vanity Fair. They had an instant rapport, and Loos remained a Vanity Fair contributor for several decades. Loos returned to California as Griffith was leaving Triangle to make longer films, and she joined director and future husband John Emerson for a string of successful Douglas Fairbanks movies. Loos and company realized Douglas Fairbanks' acrobatics were an extension of his personality, and parlayed his natural athletic ability into swashbuckling adventure roles. His Pictures in the Papers of 1916 was noted for its wry style of discursive and witty subtitles. My most popular subtitle introduced the name of a new character. The name was something like Count Exerx. Then there was a note. To those of you who read titles aloud, you can't pronounce the Count's name. You can only think it. The 5 films Loos wrote for Fairbanks helped make him a star. When Fairbanks was offered a sweetheart deal with famous players Lasky, he took the team of Emerson Loos with him at the high income of $500 a week. During this time, Loos, Fairbanks, and Emerson collaborated well together, and Loos was getting as much publicity as either Lillian Gish or Mary Pickford. Photoplay magazine labeled her the soubrette of satire. In 1918, famous players Lasky offered the couple a 4-picture deal in New York for more money than they had been making with the Fairbanks unit, and so they departed. Loos, Emerson, and fellow female writer Frances Marion migrated to New York as a group, with Loos and Emerson sharing a leased mansion in Great Neck, Long Island. Great Neck was becoming a sort of artists' colony away from the hustle and bustle of New York City, with the Fitzgeralds nearby as well. Great Neck is one of the many locations which supposedly inspired the green light dock of Gatsby. Luce wanted Marion as her chaperone, as she found herself attracted to Emerson, a man 15 years her senior, that she would refer to as Mr. E. He called her ATM for her money-making abilities. He would readily admit that he had never been, nor could be, faithful to any one female, and he would insist on once-a-week breaks from any of his female partners. Luce convinced herself he would see that she was different from all his other girls, and that behind his outwardly dull exterior was a great mind. She would later consider herself misled on both counts, writing, "I had set my sights on a man of brains to whom I could look up," she lamented, "but what a terrible let-down it would be to find out that I was smarter than he was." The pictures for famous players Lasky were not as successful as their previous films, partly because they starred Broadway headliners, not Douglas Fairbanks, not adept at screen acting, and their contract was not renewed. The scripts carried both their names, but were mostly products of Luce. Later, Luce would claim that Emerson took all the money and most of the credit, although his contribution usually consisted of observing her from bed as she worked. Much to the chagrin of her friends, her adoration of Emerson had manifested as subservience. When William Randolph Hearst offered Luce a contract to write a picture for his mistress, Marion Davies, Luce included the unnecessary Emerson in the deal. But Hearst liked the picture, and Getting Mary Married of 1919 was one of the first Marion Davies pictures that didn't lose money, which Hearst regularly reported to his investors. In addition to their films, the couple wrote 2 books, How to Write Photoplays, published in 1920, and Breaking into the Movies in 1921. Luce and Emerson turned down another picture with Davies, preferring to write for their old friend Constance Talmadge, whose brother-in-law, Joseph Schenck, husband of Norma Talmadge, was an independent producer. Both A Temperamental Wife of 1919 and A Virtuous Vamp of 1919 were great hits for Talmadge. The couple joined the Talmadges and the Schencks at the Ambassador Hotel on Park Avenue, with Constance filling the void left by the loss of her sister. When Anita and Constance weren't working, they went shopping. The Talmadge Schencks convinced Anita to summer with them in Paris without Emerson. The Talmadges hoped Luce would forget Emerson on the trip, but Emerson complained of a throat ailment, causing Luce to worry. Much of this adventure between the girls would end up as fodder for Luce's book Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Upon returning, they produced 5 more films in 16 months. During this time, Luce had filed for divorce from her estranged first husband. Emerson quickly proposed marriage, and they were married at the Schenck estate in June 1919. Luce was among the first to join Ruth Hale's Lucy Stone League, an organization that fought for women to preserve their maiden names after marriage, as she continued with hers, recognizing its brand strength. The couple moved into a modest Murray Hill apartment and cut back to 2 films a year in order to travel to save on expenses. They spent the summer in Paris. Luce and her new assistant, John Ashmore Creeland, visited many of the Paris-based writers Luce had met in America, as well as Gertrude Stein, Alice B. Toklas, Elizabeth Marbury, and Elsie D. Wolfe. And so we see Luce interacting with the pre-war lost generation. After one more film for Schenck and Talmadge, The Perfect Woman of 1920, Emerson refused another contract. After working with Actors Equity during their 1919 strike, he decided that the Luce-Emerson team should make the move to the theater, and he became heavily involved in unionization activities so he wouldn't have to work. Their first play, The Whole Town's Talking, which opened at the Bijou Theater in August 1923, received good reviews and was a moderate box office success. Soon afterward, the couple moved out of their apartment to a small house in Gramercy Park. Emerson had convinced a devastated Loos that he needed to take a break from the marriage once a week. It was on these days he would date younger women, while Loos consoled herself by entertaining her friends. The Talmadge sisters, Mama Peg Talmadge, Marion Davies, Marilyn Miller, Adele Astaire, and an assortment of chorus girls kept by prominent men. These Tuesday Widows soirees would influence her later writings, and it was with the Tuesday Widows that she visited one of her favorite hangouts, Harlem, where she developed a deep and lifelong appreciation for black culture. Sometimes I get inquiries concerning my marriage to a man who treated me with complete lack of consideration, tried to take credit for my work, and appropriated all my earnings, Loos wrote in Cast of Thousands. The main reason is that my husband liberated me, granted me full freedom to choose my own companions, and this drama was reflected in her writing for the screen. Loos had become a devoted admirer of H. L. Mencken, a literary critic and intellect. When he was in New York from his native Baltimore, she would take a break from her Tuesday Widows and join his circle, which included Theodore Dreiser, Sherwood Anderson, Sinclair Lewis, Joseph Hergesheimer, essayist Ernest Boyd, and theater critic George Jean Nathan. Loos adored Mencken, but gradually realized that high IQ gentlemen don't fall for women with brains, but those with more downstairs. In 1925, on the train to Hollywood with Mencken, she became keenly aware of this fact when he solicited the attention of a blonde in the dining car. He would marry Sarah Hart in 1930. Loos began to write a sketch of Mencken and his vacant lady friends that was published in Harper's, quadrupling their circulation overnight. This story would later become Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, turning her disappointment into comedy. Mencken was flattered by the homage, but Emerson insisted she dedicate her book to him. When But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes was published in 1927, Emerson proposed another European vacation, but went without Loos. A seriously ill Loos followed him, coming down with a sinus attack in Vienna. She and the ear, nose, and throat specialist who was treating her came up with a method of fixing Emerson's hypochondria. The doctor arranged a sham surgery for him and presented him with the polyps that had been supposedly removed from his vocal cords. This placebo treatment did the trick, and they returned with a cured Emerson. The first film version of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, now lost, was released in 1928, starring Ruth Taylor as Lorelei Lee and Alice White, one of Hearst's favorites, as Dorothy. Louise Brooks had wanted a starring role and was photographed with the book. The 1928 version was somewhat of a flop. From 1927 to 1929, Loos and Emerson traveled extensively, which was hard on Loos's health. All their winters were spent in Palm Beach, where Emerson would indulge in social climbing. Loos was starved of intellectual companionship and met Wilson Mincer in Palm Beach, a witty and charming real estate speculator and in some quarters confidence man. Though they saw each other every day, the relationship was rumored to have stopped just short of a full-blown affair. Emerson's mysterious throat ailment returned, though he recovered quickly after a second round of sham Viennese surgery. Loos and Emerson traveled to Hollywood for Christmas in 1929 with Loos's new friend, photographer Cecil Beaton, who was part of the Bright Young Things crowd. This is the crowd immortalized by Evelyn Waugh that actress Louise Brooks found dull. Wilson Mizner had relocated to Hollywood as a screenwriter. Since Emerson was entertaining other women, Loos was often in the company of Beaton or Mizner. When they returned to New York in the spring of 1930, Emerson expressed his unhappiness at her inattention, threatening a relapse of his mysterious throat ailment, and Loos would spend much more time alone in retaliation. Emerson had also lost money in the 1929 stock market crash and suggested she return to work. Loos was not unhappy with this suggestion, and within a few months had produced a stage adaptation of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes and a comedy, Cherries Are Ripe. With their income reduced, the couple moved to a residential hotel and did less traveling in 1931. Not long after, Luus came upon a love letter from one of Emerson's girlfriends. Devastated, Luus offered him a divorce. He refused and suggested they live apart, with him giving her a suitable allowance of her own money. Blaming herself for his unhappiness, she moved to an apartment on East 69th Street. However, her new life allowed her finally to spend a portion of what she earned for the couple in any way she liked. When the Emerson Loos team got an offer to write pictures for Irving Thalberg at MGM, Emerson refused to go. Loos took the $1,000 a week salary alone. The first project Thalberg handed Loos was Jean Harlow's Red-Headed Woman, because F. Scott Fitzgerald was having no luck adapting Catherine Brush's book. Fitzgerald, an accomplished writer, was fired and replaced by Loos in a predominantly male-run studio system. Fitzgerald would later write his final novel, About Hollywood, which was unfinished. The picture, completed in May 1932, was a smash hit and established Harlow as a star and put Loos once again in the front rank of screenwriters. She was a very valuable asset for MGM because the studio had so many femme fatales, Garbo, Crawford, Shearer, and Harlow, that we were always on the lookout for shady lady stories. But they were problematic because of the censorship code. Anita, however, could be counted on to supply the delicate double entendre, the telling innuendo. Whenever we had a Jean Harlow picture on the agenda, we also always thought of Anita first, according to MGM producer Samuel Marks. You can learn more about Jean Harlow's romance with William Powell on this channel. Loos moved to an apartment in Hollywood where she was unexpectedly joined by Emerson. Though Emerson expressed contrition about his previous behavior, he did nothing to change it. While Emerson busied himself offering screen tests to young starlets, Loos was now free to see whomever she pleased, including her now quite ill friend Wilson Mizner. Mizner abused his body with alcohol and drugs and wasted away until dying in April 1932, a date Loos would continue to mark. They had spent every day together for years. Wilson Mizner is noted for many bon mots, such as "be nice to people on the way up because you'll meet the same people on the way down," "never give a sucker an even break," also attributed to W.C. Fields, and "when you steal from one author, it's plagiarism. If you steal from many, it's research." When President Calvin Coolidge died in 1933, Mizner's comment was, "How do they know?" because Coolidge was known as taciturn. Mizner suffered the same fate as Dorothea Parker. Both are vividly remembered today for their witty repartee rather than for specific literary work. Irving Berlin wrote a song about Wilson, "Black Sheep Has Come Back to the Fold." He began, but did not complete, a musical based on Wilson's colorful life. Anita Luus and Robert Hopkins based the character played by Clark Gable, whom Luus saw cleaning his teeth in a water fountain one day, in the movie San Francisco on Wilson Mizner, whom Luus described as America's most fascinating outlaw. Alva Johnston wrote about him, "Mizner had a vast first-hand criminal erudition, which he commercialized as a dramatist on Broadway and a screenwriter in Hollywood. At various times during his life, he was a miner, confidence man, ballad singer, medical lecturer, man of letters, general utility man in a segregated district, card sharp, hotel man, songwriter, dealer in imitation masterpieces of art, prize fighter, prize fight manager, Florida promoter, and roulette wheel fixer. He was an idol of low society and a pet of high. He knew women, as his brother Addison said, from the best homes and houses." At MGM, Loos turned to scripts. However, she frequently had to use Emerson as a conduit to communicate with directors and other executives who balked at dealing with a woman on equal footing. She was not a suffragette and found the women's rights movements too loud. The Emerson Loos charade worked well to promote the idea that they were a happy couple and writing team. She bought a modest house in Beverly Hills in 1934. During the day, she worked, and at night, parties given by other MGM studio executives or stars, like the Thalbergs, the Selznicks, and the Goldwyns. Loos was a frequent attendee to George Cukor's Sunday brunches, which was the closest Hollywood had to a literary salon until the home of the Huxleys decades later. In 1935, about the time of the Writers Guild formation, she was paired with Robert Hopkins, who would later become a frequent collaborator. Thalberg had taken ill again and gave Emerson a 2-year contract as a producer at $1,250 a week. By mid-1937, Loos had decided not to renew her contract with MGM. Since friend and supporter Thalberg's death in September 1936, things had not been going well at the studio, and every film felt like a struggle. She signed with Samuel Goldwyn, formerly of MGM and then head of United Artists, for $5,000 a week and almost immediately regretted it. Loos soldiered on, working on unworkable scripts. In 1937, Emerson produced Saratoga, his last film. He would frequently direct Loos' scripts, knowing how she wanted them produced. In October 1937, Loos and her brother Clifford checked Emerson into a very expensive sanatorium where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia based on his frequent hypochondria. Loos, who had always left the finances to Emerson, soon discovered most of her money was no longer in joint accounts but in his own private accounts. Overworked at the Goldwyn studio and under stress from Emerson, she became more and more depressed. She bought herself out of her United Artists contract, re-signed with MGM, and bought a beachfront house in Santa Monica. After 17 years of marriage, in 1937, Loos finally asked Emerson for a divorce, and he agreed, but continued to stave off any talk of plans, making finalization and signature impossible. When Emerson was deemed well enough to leave the sanatorium, she paid for a nurse to take care of him in an apartment of his own, away from her beach house. MGM had bought the film rights to Claire Booth Loos's 1936 smash hit on Broadway, The Women, in 1937. Many writers had unsuccessfully taken a stab at a screenplay version. The studio handed it to Loos and veteran screenwriter Jane Murfin, who you can learn about on this channel, and 3 weeks later Loos handed Cukor a script that he loved. Unfortunately, the censorship board did not love it. They insisted on charging more than 80 lines, and the film had to go into production. Loos was apprehensive, but Cukor insisted she do the changes on set among his all-star bevy of leading ladies on this female-only picture that included Thalberg's widow, Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford, and Rosalind Russell. Loos made immediate friends with Paulette Goddard, who was very well read. When Hunt Stromberg, the last producer she respected, left MGM to produce independently, she tried to get out of her contract, but by then she had grown into too valuable a property to the studio. Throughout World War II, Loos wrote screenplays, grew vegetables in her victory garden, and knitted socks and sweaters for the boys overseas. She also had house guests, Aldous and Maria Huxley from England when World War II began in September 1939. The Huxleys would later have their own home and have soirees inviting Orson Welles, among many other luminaries. Loos convinced Huxley that it would be safer for his family if they stayed in the United States, as his wife was Belgian, and she got him a job adapting screenplays at MGM. Privately, she had a new partner who had a drinking problem like her father's. The relationship would be short-lived, and MGM decided to release her from her contract finally. In 1944, her beloved father died. In the fall of 1946, now a free agent, Loos returned to New York to work on Happy Birthday, a cocktail party comedy written for Helen Hayes. The play had several false starts the previous year, but now proceeded with Joshua Logan as director and produced by Rogers and Hammerstein. It opened in Boston, but the audiences hated it at first. Loos kept improving the script throughout the Boston run. When it opened in New York at the Broadhurst, it was a hit and ran for 600 performances. Katharine Hepburn was eager to play in the screen version, but the Hollywood censors weren't ready for a woman to be sloshed on screen for 2 acts and be rewarded with a happy ending. Sin had to be punished. Luce sold her Santa Monica house to her niece and made certain Emerson understood he would not be joining her in New York under any circumstances. Again in New York, she and her longtime friend, screenwriter Frances Marion, worked on an unproduced play for Zazu Pitts, who you can learn about on this channel. A few romances came her way, including from Frenchman Maurice Chevalier. Two Broadway producers wanted a musical version of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and brought in Joseph Fields as co-author for the musical production. Luce threatened to quit the production unless assured she would never have to speak to Fields again. The show opened in Philadelphia with a then unknown Carol Channing. By the time it arrived in New York, it was another success. Channing soon was elevated to an A-list star. The show played for 90 weeks and went on tour for another year. The producers closed the show when Channing became pregnant. Herman Levine commented, "I was convinced the show wouldn't work without Carol, and in my opinion it never has." A musical film version was produced in 1953, directed by Howard Hawks and adapted by Charles Lederer. It stars Jane Russell and Marilyn Monroe. Luce had nothing to do with this production, but thought Marilyn was inspired casting. The success of the film Blondes the second time around meant Luce had a greater profile than ever before. She moved to a more spacious apartment at the Langdon Hotel and bought a car. In 1950, Luce wrote A Mouse is Born, another novel, and once sent to her publisher, she left her first trip to Europe in 20 years. A Mouse is Born had a lukewarm reception, but by then Luce was already working on a dramatic adaptation of Colette's Gigi. The production was underway before Colette wired that she had found their Gigi. She had seen Audrey Hepburn in a hotel lobby in Monte Carlo. Did Audrey copy Anita's Baby Bangs? Gigi opened in the fall of 1951 and would run until the spring of 1952. By then, Hepburn had been elevated to an A-list star and was contracted to Paramount Pictures. Luce worked on more adaptations for the next few years during her travels, while relocating to an apartment on West 57th Street. The apartment was that of Paul Swans, the aging, most beautiful man in the world. Her next musical, The Amazing Adele, starring Tammy Grimes with music by Albert Selden, never got off the ground and swiftly closed. Both Emerson and Helen Hayes' husband, Charles MacArthur, died within a few weeks of each other in 1956, and the women threw themselves into their work together, with Luce working on an adaptation for Hayes filming Anastasia in London. Luce worked and traveled while being treated for a painful hand ailment that prevented her from writing. She wrote everything by hand. In 1959, Luce opened another Colette adaptation, Cherie, with Kim Stanley and Horst Buchholz in the title roles, but it only ran for 2 months. Luce also continued writing as a magazine contributor, appearing regularly in Harper's Bazaar, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker. This was the golden age of magazines, with F. Scott Fitzgerald spilling his guts regularly in Esquire and others. Biographer Gary Carey notes, "She was a born storyteller and was always in peak form when reshaping a real-life encounter to make an amusing anecdote." Luce began a volume of memoirs, A Girl Like I, published in September 1966. Her 1972 book, Twice Over Lately, New York Then and Now, was written in collaboration with her friend Helen Hayes. Kiss Hollywood Goodbye from 1974 was a Hollywood memoir about her MGM years and would be very successful, while her book The Talmadge Girls in 1978 is about the actress sisters Constance Talmadge and Norma Talmadge specifically. Natalie Talmadge was maybe left out due to delicacy over her spoiled attitude to her husband Buster Keaton. Luce would become a virtual New York institution, an assiduous party-goer and diner-out, conspicuous at fashion shows, theatrical and movie events, balls, and galas. A celebrity anecdotalist, she was also never one to let facts spoil a good story. With each book came a new spate of interviews, and as one of the last survivors of the silent era, Anita's stories became more and more exaggerated, and she was soon reported to have sold her first scenario at the age of 12. She continued to thrive on interesting people and interesting activities and held an opinion on everything, but worked hard on keeping the vivacious and flippant image and hiding her loneliness. She once commented, "I've enjoyed my happiest moments while trailing a montboucher evening gown across the sawdust-covered floor of a saloon, a California girl until the end." She was interviewed in the television documentary series Hollywood, a Celebration of the American Silent Film in 1980. After spending several weeks with a lung infection, she suffered a heart attack and died in Manhattan's Doctors Hospital in New York City at the age of 93 in 1981. She had never remarried after the death of Emerson. At the memorial service, friends Helen Hayes, Ruth Gordon, and Lillian Gish regaled the mourners with humorous anecdotes. Jewel Stein played songs from Loos musicals, including Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. An important step in the rediscovery of Loos to modern audiences has been the publication of Anita Luus Rediscovered, which collects motion picture treatments and literary fiction from each era of the writer's career. Published with the help of Mary Anita Loos, the writer's niece, who holds the bulk of Loos' papers and manuscripts, this collection may encourage more analysis of the remarkable motion picture career, with special attention to the subtle complexity of Loos's humor. For most of her adult life, Anita rose at 5 o'clock each morning to write, and her career in film spanned from 1911 to 1942. Because, in addition to motion pictures, she continued to write plays and novels, references to her abound in a wide variety of literary histories as well as biographies. Just 4 feet 11 inches tall, she rose to the heights of critical and financial success from her early stage experiences playing characters like Little Lord Fauntleroy, which earned her just enough money to help support her struggling family, to glamorous, glittering international celebrity.